For more now on how much and how little has changed since the court's landmark decision, we're joined by Brian Dooley. He's a director at Human Rights First. And Brian, thank you for coming in for our broadcast.
Thanks for having me.
60 years later, there are still problems with segregation. In fact, in the U.S., 3/4 of African Americans go to schools where people are living in poverty. How has this decision failed us?
Well, this decision addressed the problem of 1954, and in many ways it fixed a problem. But the problem is much larger than the decision tried to address then. I mean, we have now a much more sophisticated notion of what diversity is. It's now talked about much less in terms of just racial integration. And when schools are aiming for diversity now, they're looking at a whole spectrum of things about the demographic makeup of the staff, what's been taught in the curriculum, how many of the children are representative of children with disabilities, drawing kids from all different sorts of levels of household income. So the 54 decision, it would be unfair to try and use it as a yardstick to say, well, it didn't solve all the problems of diversity in education. It couldn't have, and it was never set up to do that. What it did do was to make illegal racial segregation in schools, and that was a very important step. But the goalposts have changed since then. To mix analogies, really, they've become a bit more sophisticated. The challenges are now more multi-layered than that old construction of, well, if you just mix the white kids and the black kids, you know, you'll end up with a fairer education system for everybody. It hasn't happened like that, and really, it would be wrong to expect the 54 decision to have resulted in that.
Right. Well, let's look at here in the United States. In Chicago, 50 schools recently closed, approximately in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 24. Another example of where 90% of those attending these schools were African Americans, and where there's little funding here. This is another example of socioeconomic segregation.
That's right, and I think what's interesting is how the US government has used the anniversary to reflect on the failures, if you like, of what's happened, or at least how big the problem now is. The Department of Education in the US brought out some figures yesterday conceding that only around 12% of white students in America now go to schools which can be in any way considered really multicultural. The Department of Justice concedes that it's trying to advance 20 cases across the US where the spirit of Brown versus Board is still being contested in some school districts. And 2014 is one of those years where there are many anniversaries. It's also the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. And it's interesting to see how the US government has reacted to this anniversary of the Brown versus Board education. It isn't taking a victory lap. It's not saying, you know, this was the first step in a series of successful steps and, hey presto, we fixed school segregation problems. As an historian, it's interesting to see how, for instance, tomorrow is the 40th anniversary of the Dublin Monaghan bombings and how the British and Irish governments are going to react to that. 25 years ago, of course, the Tiananmen killings and how the Chinese media and government are going to react to that in a couple of weeks and deal with those issues. So I think some credit is due to the US government in not trying to present the Brown decision as one which has managed to solve the problems of racial education. And Michelle Obama gave a pretty impressive speech this morning in Kansas, which is where the case originally was set, admitting the mistakes, or admitting at least the failures and how far there is to go now in the next 20 years.
All right. Brian, thank you so much. With Human Rights First, we really appreciate you coming in.